All right, folks, I think we'll get started. So hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us for RR-CLaN Session 6. So RR-CLAN is for the Rural Research Collaborative Learning Network. I'm Dr. Alex Stevens. I'm the Director of Research at Northern New South Wales Local Health District, and I belong to one of the member organisations of the RR-CLaN. Today, we're joined by a great team from Murrumbidgee Local Health District, so Dr. Barbara Taylor and Dr. Janelle Thomas, who along with myself will guide us through a session on tips and tricks for navigating research ethics and governance applications. So to officially get us started, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where we work and live, celebrating NAIDOC Week this week, and the theme of our elders. I want to make special mention of the traditional custodians of living culture, their connection to country and their contribution to the life of this region. We pay our respects to the ancestors and elders of the region and to all Aboriginal people, past, present, future, and any Aboriginal people that may be joining us today. So welcome. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Given the large attendance, we'll probably just scrape over 100 people joining the meeting today. We've muted your microphones, but feel free to ask questions throughout the seminar using the chat function. I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of them, but we'll endeavour to do so. Hopefully we won't take the entire hour for the presentation part of today's session. So if we do get time, we'll try to open it up at the end of the session to answer some live questions. We are recording today's session for viewing at a later date. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, just simply turn your cameras off. Now, gives me great pleasure to introduce you to today's presenters. We've got Dr. Barbara Taylor, Dr. Janelle Thomas, and myself. So Dr. Barbara Taylor is the Director of Research at Murrumbidgee Local Health District. Barbara is a periodontist and clinical scientist with extensive experience in randomised clinical trials, prospective longitudinal cohort studies, and surveys involving cardiovascular risk, diabetes, HIV/AIDS, and obstructive sleep apnea. Barbara has served on ethics committees for more than a decade and has presented her research throughout the world. Dr. Janelle Thomas is the Research Governance Officer at Murrumbidgee Local Health District. Janelle has a background in biomedical science research and has extensive lab-based research experience. Janelle completed her PhD at the Garvan Institute and has worked in Australia and also overseas. More recently, Janelle has held roles as a research coordinator, which have entailed managing research ethics and governance. And I'm Dr. Alex Stevens, the Director of Research at Northern New South Wales LHD. In this role, I have overall responsibility for research ethics and governance operations, research development support, and also strategic engagement with the broader research ecosystem. I'm a mixed background scientist and have background in the molecular biosciences. That's where I did my PhD. And also biostatistics, undergoing or undertaking a Master's of Biostatistics, and also working professionally as a biostatistician and also epidemiologist. Now, without further ado, we're going to get into today's presentation and I'll get things started off. So in terms of the overview for today's presentation, I'll speak briefly around the purpose, why we're here, what research, what are its benefits. I'll talk at a very high level on ethical and scientific review of research, speak briefly to the research journey, and then I'll hand over to Barbara, who will go into a bit more detail on step one of the research journey, which is really getting started with the research. And this is the key step before commencing an ethics application. We're going to highlight the importance of paying attention to that step. Then Janelle and I will take over for step two and go through ethical and scientific review of research and also site authorization. Hopefully be able to tell you and convey to you some tips and tricks for navigating that space successfully. So the purpose, why are we here? What is research? Well, what are its benefits? Well, what is research? The definition is handy. Research is any activity that seeks to create knowledge, insight, or understanding. We'll revisit that a little later in the presentation today. So research is a formalized process of discovery or knowledge creation, and it's underpinned by the scientific method. What exactly does this mean? Well, research is underpinned by science and its structure. What we often do when we provide advice or receive inquiries from staff in our LHD is we speak to something called the Simplified Research Framework, which is a useful way to convey that research is actually structured. It's made up of components. And for example, in this Simplified Research Framework, we've depicted six 6 simple high-level components, which might be starting with a research idea, stating your research questions, your aims and objectives. This may or may not involve hypotheses. You need to specify your research method, such as the study design you wish to adopt, specify the data collection approach, your biostatistical analysis approach, your interpretation and write-up. So research is underpinned by science and it's structured. Very quickly, what are the benefits of research? Why do we do research? We do it to solve problems, improve effectiveness or efficiency, better understand human health and disease, find better ways of doing things. So, for example, new models of care, meet the expectations that healthcare is based on science. Now, in terms of health services that engage in research, well, they benefit from tangible outcomes. And the evidence suggests that those that do tend to have lower patient mortality, higher patient confidence, satisfaction, improved staff satisfaction, recruitment and retention, which is very topical right now, improved organizational efficiency. So there are definitely tangible benefits to doing research. High-level overview of ethical and scientific review of research. So what is the purpose of ethical and scientific review of research? So according to something called the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, which in my mind, I think is the best guiding documentation for human research in Australia, it's to promote ethically good human research. So fairly plain and simple language. And also to ensure the ethical design, conduct, review, and dissemination of results arising from human research. The next few slides, don't be alarmed, and we're going to go through what looks like a lot of documents, but this is just to describe, at least from the context of New South Wales, there's a fairly well-defined and developed authorising environment for research. So I haven't had the time to go and look at what it's like in the other jurisdictions, but invariably there will be similar documents or frameworks or guiding resources that to a certain degree determine how we should be undertaking research and what are the steps that we need to navigate and successfully go through to start research. From the New South Wales perspective, you'll see that there are a suite of research ethics policies and guidelines. Similarly, there are a suite of research governance policies and guidelines, and there may be several other important documents in here. I've just listed a couple of them. One relates to intellectual property arising from health research, and another one is data privacy, confidentiality considerations. And in the New South Wales context, a really handy document is the Statutory Guidelines on Research for the Health Records and Information Privacy Act. What we will do is at the end of the presentation later today or tomorrow, I'll send everyone that's registered a copy of these slides, which will have all of these hyperlinks. I'll talk very briefly now about the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. So I referred to this earlier. I say this is my favourite document for guidance around human research in Australia. If you are considering undertaking research, it is highly advisable to consult this document. It underpins Human Research Ethics Committee, so HREC function, and also the Human Research Ethics application, which we'll speak a little bit more later on in the seminar today. This is what HRECs refer to when evaluating applications. So trust me, I've been on a HREC for probably about 5 or 6 years now, and it's crucial. We are always looking at the national statement to guide us when evaluating applications. It's a comprehensive guide on the nature of human research, risk associated with research, specific elements relating to sampling, recruitment, consent, and ethical considerations for specific research fields and participants, for example, biospecimens, lab-based research, human genetics, and also a suite of specific participants. Super useful document to refer to. Now, according to the national statement, and I will not go through all of this, it's just to highlight a particularly important fact is research or human research is conducted with or about people or their data or their tissue. So research is broadly any activity that seeks to create new knowledge or insight, which was the exact same definition I used earlier on in the presentation. And really, it sets the threshold for research quite low. So this is from probably the peak guiding document for human research in Australia. Activities simple as taking part in surveys, interviews, focus groups constitutes research, or even simply being observed by researchers constitutes human research through the lens or the view of the national statement. So that's important to bear in mind when you're undertaking these types of activities. I'll talk a little bit about research risk because it is a really important element, particularly with respect to the human research ethics application. So ethics committee, as well as undertaking a scientific review of the research, will look at the ethical considerations, and the main component of the ethical considerations relates to risk. Chapter 2 of the national statement is dedicated to the assessment of risk, and the assessment of risk involves identifying any risks in a proposed activity, gauging the probability and severity of these risks, assessing the extent to which these risks can be minimized, determining whether the risks are justified by the potential benefits of the proposed research or activity, and also determining how those risks can be managed and mitigated. In the national statement, currently there are 3 broad levels of risk, which are defined as inconvenience, discomfort, and harm. Just to note that this is currently under review or revision, and what I've heard is potentially risk will take on more of a spectrum form where there'll be low risk on one end of the spectrum and then high risk on the other. But currently we've got 3 broad levels of risk. So inconvenience, which is also called negligible risk. An example there is, or examples include filling in a form, participating in a street survey, or giving up time to participate in research constitute or provides you a bit of an example of what negligible risk looks like. Discomfort, so known as low risk. The examples there include minor side effects of medication, discomforts related to measuring blood pressure, and anxiety induced by an interview. So it's all pretty low risk. Anything that is foreseeably greater than discomfort falls into the harm category. And this basically is defined where a person's reactions by participating in research exceed discomfort and become distress. These are viewed as harm. So these automatically become higher than low risk activities or applications. So knowing risk is not only good for being able to populate your human research ethics application, it can actually be useful in determining what type of review or pathway you can choose to have your research project reviewed. All high and low risk applications must be reviewed by a fully constituted human research ethics committee. Fair enough. However, currently negligible and low risk research that can be reviewed under expedited processes, that could be a human research ethics subcommittee or an executive committee of the HREC, or it could actually be non-HREC levels of review if they've been established in your organisation. There's also a certain class of research that can be exempted from a review entirely. This is defined in section 5.1.22 of the national statement. And these are basically negligible risk research applications that involves the use and analysis of existing data collections that only contain non-identifiable data about human beings. So basically, we use this a lot, for example, in our own organisation for retrospective data analyses. The research journey. So I won't spend much time on this slide at all, but I've just included this infographic, this picture here to describe that research is actually a journey and it comprises of multiple steps. And what we're dealing here right now with the ethical and scientific review of research and site authorization is just one of those steps. And what Barbara will do once I hand over to her very, very shortly is provide a little bit of detail into the importance of step 1, which is getting started with research, writing a detailed research protocol, because this makes the rest of the process much easier to navigate, particularly step 2. Step 3 can be viewed as conducting the actual research activity or study. Step 4, which probably could be viewed as something you do concurrently with step 3, is monitoring of the activity and annual reporting. And then step 5 is dissemination of the research findings and considerations for the future. So I'm going to hand over to Barbara now, who will guide you through step 1, so getting started with the research, a key step before commencing an ethics application. Barbara, over to you.
Hello, Yama. Welcome to Wiradjuri. Welcome from Wiradjuri country in NAIDOC Kuwait. And I'm so glad that so many people have showed up to hear us talk about tips and tricks for submitting research ethics and governance applications. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. As Alex mentioned, research has certainly broadened my horizons. He talked about a research journey, and it certainly led to a lot of travel for me, working with colleagues throughout the world, from Sydney, where I used to live before I saw the light and moved to the Riverina, from Sydney to Norway, and in between colleagues in Washington State and excuse me for a moment. So the centre picture at the bottom is Norway, Fjord at midsummer, where the sun will rise at 4 a.m. this morning and set at 11:15 in the evening. Unfortunately, it's only going to be about 18 degrees and it'll be raining. The left-hand picture you might think is Wagga Wagga, and it certainly feels like that at this time of year, but it isn't that. Research is a journey. Can I have the next slide, please? You'll have noticed probably that my hair has changed colour as well, and I'm not sure whether that's causation or correlation, but we'll leave that discussion for another day. Often when people, and I'm not suggesting that applies to all the people online, but often when people talk about an ethics application or a site approval application, they're really confronted by the horror of the whole thing. And sometimes we find that people actually haven't really done any planning or set down their ideas in words before they come to do the ethics application, which makes it difficult because every time they look at a new question on Regis, they think, oh my goodness, I haven't thought about that. But in fact, most of us have organised a journey, even if it's only a journey to the next town. Many of us have travelled overseas and we've planned quite complex adventures. We've had a purpose for our journey, research or otherwise, to go to a wedding, your wedding, somebody else's wedding, see relatives, visit your bucket list. You've got milestones, where you're going to go, places you're going to stop, and you'll have sought travel advice. If it's a holiday, it might be friends and relatives, and you might Google. But if it's a research journey, you need to talk to colleagues and mentors and line managers, especially if you're relatively inexperienced in research methods. You'll need a timeline, a plan, a schedule for your trip or your research. And in your research journey, you need to sort out the feasibility. The same with your holiday. Are you going to take your private plane and stay at the Park Hyatt and 5-star hotels all the way? Are you going to go economy class? One of the few benefits I can tell you of being short is that economy isn't as much as a trial for me as it is for some taller people. But anyway, are we going to stay in backpackers? What are we going to do? So we're going to look at feasibility, and we're going to think about what's reasonable, what will actually get the job done. We've got governance, and this is where ethics and site approvals come in, which aligns with passport and visa requirements. We have to go out and look and see what the visa requirements are in the different places that we're going to go to. And we have to look a long way ahead of time in case, passports run out or, take a long time to get delivered and processed and so on. And then we get to our methodology, which is a lot more detailed, but where we really have to think about exactly what we're going to do, what we're going to put in that case, how we're going to do it, how we're going to carry it around, transfers, airports, ports of entry. You're going to carry it. How are you going to get it around? Can't be too heavy, can't be too cumbersome. And then, of course, there's if you're funded for your research, it's financial transactions and reporting. It's the credit card bill when it comes in after the trip. And of course, there's the surprise events, the adverse events, things that can happen, checking in, water control, arriving at the airport and discovering that the flight's not going to go because one of the runways has been closed, something like that. Next slide, please. So, yeah, the first slide made it look as though my research journey was press conferences and overseas travel and having a good time, and things aren't always like that. So yes, that's me praying and banging my head on the wall at the same time in the clinic. And that really is our first laboratory on the bottom right. When we started, we had in the particular studies that I'm thinking about right now, we had no funding, no laboratory, no equipment, no water supply, and of course, no worries. Fortunately, we got funding from the NH and MRC and an equipment grant, and a lot more laboratory space became available. So we're fortunate. Next slide, please. So the research journey, before we got to the point of fronting the cameras and the media and publishing, we did the research and we gathered data, which took several years for some studies. But before that, we applied for and obtained ethics approval. That actually only took a few hours. Sometimes when I hear about people's research journeys, it's almost like the ethics approval is the worst, most troublesome part of the whole journey. But in actual fact, it shouldn't be a burden or so much of a burden if beforehand we think, we ask, we discuss, we listen, and we plan. So have your plans ready. Have really thought through your research project before you sit down to tackle that ethics application or site approval. Can I have the next slide, please? So what I've written down here is I'm going to talk on about I've grouped research into three main areas: audits and surveys, qualitative research, and intervention studies. And I've just put down some of the points that I've picked up over the years from working in research governance or actually conducting audits or surveys myself, or being part of a group that's conducted such research. I'll regularly have JMOs or RMOs ring me, and they want to do an audit or a survey of some sort, and I know that very often that they want to have a small project to put on their CV so that they can apply for a training program or something like that. But research actually has to help our patients, our clients. I realise they want the project to help them, but is it going to help the service? Is it going to help health outcomes or processes in some way? What is the question? And sometimes, people really haven't thought to themselves what the question is that they're going to seek to answer. And one of the topics that people often want to investigate is neck and femur fractures. And sometimes I've had people contact me and say, oh, they're going to conduct an audit with something to do with neck and femur fractures. And I'll say, oh, so-and-so is doing something, or that they did something in that area a year or two ago. You're going to have to talk to them. Oh, no, I don't want people to know about my topic. Well, you're not going to get the Nobel Prize for it. It's really good to go and look at the literature, talk to other people, see what's been done beforehand, and see, can you build on what's already happening. You don't want to conduct a whole project and then find that somebody else did it and published it already, because it might not be adding significantly to what's already out there. I think the third point there will bring joy to people's hearts, because sometimes an audit or a survey sometimes is not actually a research project. Sometimes it's a quality activity and ethical approval might not be required. There's a couple of policies that you can go and read yourself about this. There's one on the NHMRC website, and if you simply put in NHMRC Research Quality Policy, you'll get a link to it, and you can read it and work out whether your survey is a quality activity or a search. Bear in mind that if you do want to publish it or present it at some stage, that sometimes editors require ethics approval for projects. So already have thought ahead and think to yourself, if I'm going to publish it somewhere or present it somewhere, where are the avenues that I might go to, and have a look at the editor's guidelines for those in those areas. You can also search the Office of Health and Medical Research website at New South Wales Health. Policies and guidelines are there, and there is a policy on quality activities. You just need to scroll down a bit and it's right there. Think about how you're going to publicise and distribute your survey or audit. If it's going to be via the socials, via social media and so on, talk to your media unit ahead of time and see how can we do this? What do they advise? Make it easy to read, make it easy to complete. I think we've probably all had the experience of looking at a survey online and it says 5-minute survey and you realise it's got to 4.5 minutes and you've only done 3 questions because, you know, there's a free text box that says, please explain the reasons for your choice. 5 minutes, sorry, I'm too busy, click. And so you've lost the goodwill of that participant. Cover all the bases in your answers. Nil, not applicable, and none might be the answer to your question. Limit free text because it's extra work for you because you're going to have to analyse it, work out the themes that are in there. And of course, try to a statistician or plan your statistical design really early, not after you've done the data collection, because that way you can simplify it. You can make life a bit easier for yourself. Can I have the next slide, please, where we're switching to talk about qualitative research. Principally focus groups and one-on-one interviews. And I've got there some points about thinking about the environment where, if it's not virtual, thinking about the environment if interviews and focus groups are face-to-face. Think about the location and distancing and capacity and privacy. Think carefully around the availability of space. You might think that the waiting room at 5 o'clock will be pretty quiet. It will until the cleaner walks in. So have a think about where you might conduct interviews, and also think about the comfort of the participants, lighting and sound, different levels of seating. Once you've drafted your questions, ask friends or colleagues if they can have a look at your questions in your in audits or surveys, and also in qualitative research, because what might appear to be perfectly obvious and readable to you or me, because we need to have a different point of view. So ask someone else to go through it and see if they find it understandable and straightforward. Just the other day, somebody here in Murrumbidgee asked me about a survey on voluntary assisted dying, which will be introduced in Murrumbidgee when it becomes law here later this year. And that's the typical sort of subject where it could trigger emotions and memories that can be quite distressing for participants. So think about in qualitative research and also in surveys whether you need to have any backup support and referral pathways available. don't forget that people's reactions to distressing subjects might occur during an interview or might be delayed. It might be the next day, the next week. Is the option in research to pay someone to collect data for you? So, for example, to conduct interviews for focus groups or one-on-one interviews. And generally speaking, we would need to get a grant to get funding from a grant to do that. Welcome to a special sort of hell, which could be the topic of an entire different webinar, and I won't progress that one today. Think about how you're actually going to record information. How many favors you can ask of your friends and colleagues who might be one and the same. Will you have somebody taking notes? Will you have a scribe? If you're using equipment, make sure you've got power. It's not going to run out in the middle of an interview. Remember, if you have 15 people interviewed for 1 hour, that's going to be 15 hours of listening and 15 hours of transcribing. And then after that, in your plan, have thought to yourself, how are you going to extract themes from all those interviews? So at the moment, I'm mentoring somebody who's got a HITI grant, and just went through some interviews for that person, and extracted some themes, as are some of the other members of the research team, to help progress that project. And we were all engaged in that project in settling on the questions for interviews and questions for surveys a year or 18 months ago when we were helping to plan this project. So with this project, we started at the top of that list on the slide, and now we're down at this spot where we're extracting the themes. You can use artificial intelligence software, almost, I guess, the reverse of ChatGPT, to extract themes from transcriptions that you've taken. We don't have lots of resources for that here, so we're using real humans to extract the theme. Okay, next slide, please. Intervention studies. Okay, so we're getting to more complex research design here. And I can't emphasize how important it is to be up to date with what the state of the art is in your area. I don't want you to waste any of your time on reinventing something when you have the capacity, the ability to take science the next step along in the journey. So be up to date, follow what's happening in your area, and chat. Then when you're thinking about your project, chat with the people around you who could be involved or affected. And that might be people that you don't normally interact with face to face, but who might still be involved. And I've put chat as distinct from speak to or talk to or discuss with, because chat has the implication of having more of a relationship, having more of a collegiate relationship where you can chat with these people and all work together to deliver something worthwhile. Of course, if you're going to use any equipment, it should be standardized. So if, for example, you're going to measure blood pressure or use an ECG for people over a period of time, it needs to be standardized. You need to be using the same equipment. So make sure that you've got access to the equipment. You've got somewhere to store it, that it's well maintained. You're not going to change it in the middle of your study. journal all your research activities. As a year down the track, you won't remember what you did. Every time you're in the lab or in the clinic or at your desk doing something with your research project, make a short note with the date, what you did, so that you've got a record so that you can always go back and have a reference. I mentioned inter-hospital and international transfers there because we might be transferring specimens, certainly in Murrumbidgee, from outlying clinics into base hospitals. And certainly in our district, that can be subject to snow in the snowy mountains or boiling heat out towards Western New South Wales. So think about if materials need to be transferred, if they're going to be affected by temperature and so on. And I could tell you the story about how ones that we sent to Seattle were delayed at Dallas on the ground and then impounded at customs in Seattle. But that's a story for another day. Except that one of my colleagues managed to talk his way through customs and tip dry ice over the package at Seattle Airport. Anyway, with research that a project you might be planning to conduct, set it down in writing what you're going to do. Don't rely on the corporate memory being embedded with you. So I might have been leading the projects that we ran in our clinic, but it would be really unwise for everything, all the corporate memory of it, to just be embedded with me. So all the members of our team contributed to our manual of procedures, and there was always a reference with all the information about what we did at any stage in our trials. We thought ahead of time about our data form design. Some of it was in Excel, some of it was in Microsoft Access. Different members of the team upskilled as required. And I know that looks very IT. It looks though I could be computer literate, but I got to tell you, my Excel upskilling was buying Excel for Dummies. RedCap, I did the New South Wales Health training, and Microsoft Access, I took myself off to a two-day workshop. The next point I thought about was authorship for articles and presentations. With our group, it was one in, all in. Everybody who did useful contributions to a project was on the papers. But make sure you've sorted that out at the beginning, or not having arguments at the end. Think ahead of time that when you complete your successful project and you want to present it via journals, conferences, posters, digital, virtual, think ahead of time where you might want to do that, and be prepared for it at least months ahead, so that you've got plenty of time to get yourself prepared. I think that's as many tips as I have in me for the time available. That there isn't actually really a word for goodbye in Wiradjuri. So I'll just say Mandanguwu, which means thank you, and thank you for listening. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that very in-depth overview of the importance, I guess, of planning prior to getting to this next step, which Janelle and I will go through now on ethical scientific review and site authorization. So hopefully what we'll do in the next 15 minutes is guide you through some of these steps and hopefully provide a few handy tips for you to be able to navigate successfully through ethical and scientific review and also site authorization. So I'll talk a little bit about ethical and scientific review. I view this as a life cycle. So as Barbara really elegantly mentioned, it's very important to plan your study before you get to considering ethical and scientific review. You need to plan your study, prepare detailed study protocol and any associated documents. If you've done that, the next step is to consider populating something called the Human Research Ethics Application, or the HREA. So the HREA is the predominant ethics application used by the Australian Public Health Organisation. It was developed probably in 2014 by the NHMRC. I think it was released for use live in around 2016, and since then it's pretty much been adopted by all states and jurisdictions in Australia for use for public health organisation based research. The HRIA, this is a screen grab of the HRIA that I want from one of my applications from Regis. Looks a little bit like this. It comprises of a series of sections and subsections. Hopefully, this will be able to guide applicants to provide details on the ethical and scientific considerations of their proposed activity relating to the design, the method, the study participants, and any other relevant elements. Well, this is a screen grab of what the HRIA looks like in Regis. So Regis stands for Research Ethics Governance Information System. Bear in mind that there, and I'll go through this in the next slide, there are multiple systems where you can find the HRIA. Invariably, though, the HRIA should look very similar to this. It will have these sections and subsections, and it's there in order to guide applicants to complete those sections in a way that corresponds to the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. In terms of the systems available, well, there are multiple, as I mentioned. So if you happen to be submitting an application for consideration in South Australia, you'll be using something called Research GEMS, which stands for Research Governance and Ethics Management System. If you happen to be in Queensland or Victoria, you'll use Ethics Review Manager, which is an Informatica product. If you're in ACT or New South Wales, you'll be using Research Ethics and Governance Information System. These are my handy tips for submitting ethics applications. Take the time to consider which HREC you want to submit to, particularly if you're planning to do a multi-site project, so multi-site either within and or between jurisdictions. So if you are intending to do a multi-site project, highly advisable to submit your application to something called a certified HREC, as through something called National Mutual Acceptance, your project will only require review by one HREC. The decision of that HREC will be accepted by the other sites, and then each participating site will navigate through its respective research governance processes to deal with local site governance matters. If you can, access research templates. So your research office and or organisation may be able to direct you to useful templates such as research protocols, participant information sheets, and consent forms. As an example, I've included a link here to what we have in Northern New South Wales. We've got research protocol, participant information sheet, consent form, and a variety of other templates. Also, I've got a link here to some of the NHMRC resources. More tips: be thorough, precise, and detailed in your study protocol. This is probably the biggest deficit we see for projects submitted through our HREC, just a lack of detail. Same goes with the associated documents and the HRIA. We typically take the view that the study protocol should be written with sufficient detail that would enable another team of suitably qualified investigators to replicate the study. Important areas to focus on where there are typically ethical considerations are sampling, recruitment, consent. Risks is an obvious one and how to mitigate them. Elements or aspects that deal with data, the privacy, confidentiality, and the secure storage of data. Try to adopt useful and informative file naming conventions. Here I've linked this part to a LibGuide from Princeton University as handy conventions for file naming, really useful. Use version control, so include version number and date in the footer of all documents. Submit your ethics application and supporting document before the submission closing date of whichever HREC you're submitting to, and know which HREC you plan to submit to. Very briefly, at the end here, I'll talk about responding to HREC comments, which in my view is the cycle part in life cycle. So very rarely will an ethics application be approved upon initial review by the committee. It typically always requires another round of review. So invariably, applicants will need to respond to reviewers' comments. So when doing this, be mindful, be thorough in your responses. Try to capture all of the main elements that the committees are raising in their comments. Make sure you respond to the actual concerns raised by the comments. Don't go on a tangent, don't do something different. Pay attention to what they are raising in their comments. Don't be adversarial in your responses, and this can be very tempting, but just bear in mind the Human Research Ethics Committee members are just humans. They don't always get everything right. And if there are anything that does come across as probably being incorrect or as a misconception or as a misunderstanding, just politely explain them away. Just politely remind the Ethics Committee of potentially why they haven't quite got it right, and it will be fine. Respond to the committee's comments in a structured way. We typically advise our applicants to use a cover letter and then some sort of structured response to the committee's comments. So this could be a table of responses or some other structured way. Use track changes when updating your study documents. If not, it virtually becomes impossible for the committee to review the updates to your application. Often they'll just knock it back and say, resubmit the track changes. And again, in your revised submission, use version control, number and date. So now I'm going to hand over to Janelle, who will talk about site authorization of research governance. Janelle.
Thanks, Alex. Just being mindful of time, I will try and skip through this information quickly. As Alex mentioned, there are a few resources scattered along here, and he will be able to provide those slides to you. So if you miss information, don't worry, you can always view the links later. So site authorization is the second part of your research governance approval process, and all research projects must receive site authorization either by a site-specific assessment, which is the Regis-specific name for it. These may vary slightly if you're in states other than New South Wales and are using a different system, as mentioned by Alex. It also may be possible, depending on the project, to receive site authorization via access request application, and I'll touch on that briefly in a moment. A key point is that a project cannot commence at a particular site until both ethics approval and site authorization is in place. If you are setting up a multi-site study and you get partway through the process and think, look, I'd actually like to add an additional site or sites, that's not a problem at all. You can do that after you've got ethics approval, and you can do that by submitting an ethics amendment. That's quite a straightforward process. There is quite useful information and advice around site authorization, and that's available on the Office for Health and Medical Research website, or the OHMR. Next slide, please, Alex. There are a few key considerations that we came to get put together for undertaking your project at a specific site. There's really sort of three key ones that we came up with, and they relate to, and really think about these before you approach people at a site if you are wanting them to be involved in your research project. Firstly, consider the suitability of the site, and by this I mean, will it have the right facilities and equipment that you need? Will it have enough potential participants, which may be an issue if you're considering approaching sites that are in some of the smaller rural LHDs? Please think about key stakeholder engagement. This is actually probably the most important thing to consider when you're approaching a specific site. Basically, who's going to be a champion for your project at this site? Who's going to help it succeed? And there's probably, well, certainly at least three key people you will need to approach and have on board for your project. And that's the principal investigator, who will lead the project at a particular site, and they'll be responsible for submitting your site authorization application and also any downstream amendments that need to be done. Do you need to get associate investigators on board who will help you do specific parts of your project? Also importantly, you'll need to engage a head of department. This is someone who will be distinct from the principal investigator, but will also be key in terms of being a champion for your project and providing sign-off for it in Regis or your submission platform. Then also please think about resourcing, and the obvious thing for this is budget and finance, to have those in place if applicable, but also think about the availability of staff. Are you going to have people there who are going to have the time to approach participants, send out surveys, whatever it may be? And also consider in-kind support in terms of, has the place got the right facilities and equipment, but also will the people that you're getting on board have that hour a week to help you with your research project. The little box on the right there, just wanted to mention that too. Some LHD research officers now require a meeting with the investigators before you actually submit an SSA application. And this is just to really make sure your application is streamlined, really makes it flow through the system quite quickly so that you can get underway with your research as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. The other thing to consider with your site application is supporting documentation. You will certainly need to submit all of your HREC approved documentation. Most of the time, these things will appear in Regis and be transferred across to your site application. Depending on your project, you may need to consider site-specific participant information sheets and consent forms. The kind of information you might need to put here are site-specific logos, site-specific contact details, and also some projects, if they've got modules, perhaps not all of those modules will be done at all of your sites. So you need to think about, does this part of my project need to be in the PIC for Murrumbidgee or not? You may need to consider an email of introduction for your site investigators to distribute to potential participants. It might also be valuable to gain and submit a letter of support from key site stakeholders. And this is actually quite helpful for RGOs when they're reviewing applications, just to know who within their organisation is on board with the project. Consider a site-specific budget as applicable, and you also may need to consider a clinical trials research agreement or other agreement as appropriate for your project. Alex did touch on this before, in that some LHDs, including Northern New South Wales, research officers have site-specific templates on their web pages, for example, for your participant information sheet. So have a look around and see whether those documents might be available for the site that you might want to undertake your research at. Next slide, please. When you're completing your SSA application, and I'm just being aware of time here, I'll try and skip through this. For New South Wales, at least, and ACT and Tasmania, you will need to submit through Regis. Some sections of your SSA form will auto-populate from the HRR document. I think probably the key part is to select a department and a head of department or a HOD in Part C of your form. The HOD will need to provide sign-off for it before the application can then go to review by the RGO and authorisation by the delegated person in a particular LHD. A really helpful thing to add into Part C is to just put a quick summary of the site implications for the HOD. What do they need to know before they approve? Might only be 1, 2 or 3 sentences, a few dot points, but it's really valuable to streamline getting signed off by your HOD quickly. As I mentioned before, include all your site-specific documentation, and another really handy thing to do is to actually contact the HOD before you submit your project when you're almost ready to submit, and just let them know about it, so that when they get this automated email from Regis saying please sign off on such and such a project, they'll go, oh right, okay, yep, I know what that's about. It really does help to streamline. Next slide, please. Just quickly touching on access request applications. This can be maybe an alternative way of getting your site authorization as an alternative to an SSA. It is suitable for projects that tend to be called light touch projects. So you may only want to have recruitment through posters or leaflets, or distribution of a survey or questionnaire, or have access to data or tissue held at a particular public health organisation, but that doesn't actually involve conducting the research at that particular facility. This is something that is submitted to your local research governance officer. It doesn't go through Regis, but there is really valuable information about the access request process, including the form, and that's available on the OHMR website, and the link for that's there at the bottom of that slide. Next slide, please, which is, I think, my last one. Couple of extra kind of bottom line tips. Regis has numerous quick reference guides and also videos, which are really quite helpful. They really do step you through all the steps of submitting your ethics and SSA applications. If you've still got queries when you've kind of put all your documentation together, you're not sure about who to contact or what to do, it may be worthwhile contacting the RGO for the particular site that you want to conduct your research at. And there is a list of both of all of the New South Wales HRECs and all of the research governance officers around the state on the OHMR website, and the link for that's there. And then finally, recently the Sydney Health Partners have developed a governance checklist, which is used by some LHDs in New South Wales. Might be useful going and having a look at that, just to check whether you've got all the documentation that you think you will need for your project before you submit your site governance application. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janelle, for that excellent overview, I guess, of site authorization for that research governance process. Just in the last few minutes, I'll give a plug for the next session that we're holding through the RR-CLaN. This will be an overview of referencing software. We'll do that very early on in August. If you can, I've just submitted a link to a very short evaluation survey that we're doing through REDCap as an opportunity for you to let us know how we've done. So if you please take a few minutes to complete that, that would be appreciated. What I will do, I know there's only 2 minutes left and people might head off to the next meeting, but I have unmuted people's microphones. If there are any burning questions, please feel free to ask. I think the easiest way to do it is just to put your hand up using the raise your hand function, and we'll try to get to them in the order that you've raised your hand. Linda.
Sorry, I was a bit late getting to this. Has it been recorded?
Yes, so the sessions are all recorded, and hopefully I'll be able to post it to our CLAN YouTube channel in the next day or two. And then I typically notify all of those that registered that the recording's been posted.
Great, thank you.
No worries. Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you learned something useful. I want to thank Barbara and Janelle for their valuable contributions. Enjoy the rest of the day, folks, and hopefully we'll see you for the next RR-CLaN session in August. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.